The wind howled through the broken boards. The snow fell like it meant to bury the world whole. And inside a dark barn, two children waited in silence, one barely breathing, the other ready to fight anyone who came close. And then the door opened. A man stepped inside with a lantern, and in that flickering light, 3 lives changed forever. This is not just a story of survival. It's a story of what happens when mercy walks into the dark.
It had been 7 long years since John Carter held a child's hand. Not since that terrible night the earth was frozen solid, forcing him to wait for the sun to bury his wife and the little one she never met. So, when his lantern light cut across a dark corner of the barn and found them, 2 little figures huddled in the hay, one burning hot with fever, the other aiming a jagged rock right at him, he froze. He just stood still while the blizzard howled, snow dusting in through the walls, and felt a 7-year-old lock on his heart break wide open. If you have ever loved a child, lost a child, or just wished for a helping hand that never came, then this story is for you. Be sure to subscribe and stick with us to the end, and let us know what city you are watching from in the comments. I would love to see just how far this story can reach. That storm had been gathering its strength since noon. John felt it coming in his shoulder long before he saw it in the sky. It was that deep, grinding pain where he had been thrown from a wild stallion 12 years back. His body could predict the weather better than any almanac. By the time the horses were fed and the north fence was checked, the wind had gotten plain nasty. Not just cold, but mean. The kind that hits you sideways and snakes into every gap in your coat, like it had a personal grudge against you. He dragged the big barn doors closed behind him and threw the latch twice for good measure. And that is when he heard something. It was not the wind. He was well acquainted with the wind. After 11 years on this piece of Wyoming land, he knew every single sound it could make. The whistle through the gap in the roof, the low moan around the chimney, even the rhythm of the loose shutter on the cabin's east wall that sounded almost like a visitor. This was different. It was a small, tight sound, nearly lost beneath the storm. The kind of noise something makes when it is trying its best to be absolutely silent. John froze there in the dark, halfway between the barn and the cabin, his lantern swaying and snow biting at his neck. He listened with everything he had, just like his father taught him to. Son, don't just listen with your ears. Listen with your gut. Listen. Your gut will hear what your ears can't. There it was, a quick, sharp breath, followed by silence, and then a cough that was muffled in a hurry. He turned back toward the barn. The latch was right where he left it. He had just locked it moments ago, but the barn's south side, the old part he used for storage since cutting his herd to 4 horses, had a busted board near the ground he kept meaning to fix. A grown man could never get through that opening, but something small sure could. John lifted the latch and eased the heavy door open. He took a step inside, holding the lantern up high. In their stalls, the horses shuffled around, their ears twitching, but they were not spooked. Whatever was in here had been around long enough for the horses to get used to it. That meant it had been a good while, maybe over an hour. He walked down the center aisle, his boots quiet on the hay-strewn floor, the lantern swinging from side to side. The storage area was way in the back, behind a low wall made of old timbers. He rounded the edge of that wall and just stopped in his tracks. There they were, in the farthest corner, tucked where the 2 walls met, and half covered in hay like they tried to make a nest for warmth. 2 small figures. The older one sat straight up against the wall, knees to her chest, with her arms wrapped tight around the smaller one. The moment the light touched her face, her head snapped up, and her tired, sharp green eyes locked onto his, freezing him right where he stood. In her right hand, she held a good-sized rock with a sharp, jagged edge. She held it ready by her shoulder, arm pulled back, not even blinking when the light hit her. She just stared with those watchful, hollowed-out eyes, her jaw clenched so tight he could see the muscle jumping in her cheek. If she was a day over 9 years old, he would be surprised. "Stay back," she said. Her voice was steady, a lot steadier than her body, which shook so badly the hay around her rustled. John stayed put. He held the lantern steady and kept his hands in plain sight. He had stared down drunk cowboys, raging bulls, and a man with a shotgun who swore John cheated him at cards. But none of them had a look like this little girl. A look that said she had figured all the angles and did not care what happened so long as the little one beside her was safe. "I am not here to hurt you," John said softly. "That is what everyone says." She kept the rock raised. "You get back, or I will throw this thing." "Easy now." He took a slow step backward. "All right, I am back." For just a split second, her eyes flicked down to the boy. And in that moment, John understood it all. The boy was much smaller. His blonde hair stuck to his forehead with sweat, even in the bitter cold. He was leaning hard against his sister's side, his face buried in her coat. He was not moving like a sleeping child should. He was far too still. John felt his own jaw tighten. "Is that your brother?" he asked in a low voice. She gave no answer. "He is sick," John stated. It was not a question. "He is just fine." The rock stayed steady in her hand. "We will leave as soon as this storm breaks." "This storm is not breaking tonight." "Then we will go tomorrow." John slowly knelt down, getting on her level, trying to seem smaller and less of a threat. The cold floor bit right through his pants, but he paid it no mind. "What is your name?" he asked her. There was only silence. "My name is John," he offered. "John Carter. This here is my barn, and that is my land. I am not with the county, or with anyone else." He saw a quick flicker of something in her eyes when he said, "County." She hid it fast, but he saw it. "My name does not matter," she replied. "Fair enough." His voice was low and calm, the same one he used on spooked colts. "But your brother has a fever. I can tell even from here." "How long has he been like this?" Her chin came up. "He is fine." "How long?" he repeated gently. Not pushing, just asking, like it was a simple question from one practical person to another. The rock in her hand trembled just a little. "Since yesterday morning," she finally admitted. The words sounded raw, stripped of all the toughness she was trying to show. John's eyes went back to the boy, noting the sweat, the labored breathing of his small chest, and the faint blue color around his lips. "He needs to be warm and he needs water," John said. "And I have some herbs in the cabin that will help with that fever. I am not asking for your trust. I am just telling you what that boy needs." "I know what he needs." Her voice broke on the last word, and he could tell she hated it. He saw the anger at herself in her face. She clamped her mouth shut, her eyes flashing fiercely, daring him to say a word about it. He did not mention it. That was her pride, and it deserved respect. He cleared his throat. "What is his name?" John asked. There was a long silence. The wind hit the side of the barn, making her flinch and pull the boy even closer. "Billy," she said at last. "Billy." John said the name back, as if tucking it away somewhere safe. "And what is yours?" She studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face like a man reads a contract that has tricked him before, looking for the catch hidden in the kind words. "Mary," she answered. "Mary." He gave a single nod. "All right, Mary, I am going to stand up nice and slow and go to my cabin to get what Billy needs. You can stay right here. You can even keep that rock. But I am bringing back help, and I will set it on the ground right over there. Then you can decide." She just stared at him. "Why?" she asked. The question was plain and simple, with no fight left in it, just tired and real. "Because he is 6 years old," John answered. "And no 6-year-old boy should be sick in a barn during a blizzard." Mary swallowed hard, just once. She did not lower the rock, but she did not throw it either. John got to his feet slowly, turned his back on them, and walked out toward the cabin. The moment he was outside, the cold wind slapped him right in the face. He lowered his head and walked as fast as he could. Inside the cabin, every move he made had a purpose. He put the kettle on the stove. He grabbed the tin of dried willow bark and elderberry he had stored back in September. It was good for a fever and a cough. He found a clean cloth and took the wool blanket from the end of his own bed. It was his thickest one, the one with the patch in the corner from an ember 3 winters back. He remembered what Mary had told him. That is what everyone says. And he thought about what life must have taught her to expect from a man approaching her in the dark. He picked up his lantern and headed back out into the heart of the storm. When he stepped back into the barn, Mary was on her feet. She had somehow managed to get Billy standing, holding him tightly against her. His little head just rolled on her shoulder. She was braced against the wall, her feet planted apart and her jaw set firm. She was holding 60 pounds of a sick little boy with the kind of grit you see in someone who has never been allowed to set their burdens down. John stopped right there. He did not get any closer. He placed everything down on the ground, the blanket, the kettle with its handle wrapped, and the tin of herbs. He put it all close enough for her to reach, but far enough that he was not forcing it on her. "You do not have to let me carry him," he said. "But you have got to let him lie down somewhere warm. You have been holding him up for hours, and he needs to be flat." She glanced down at Billy's face, and he saw something in her expression begin to change. "Quiet." "Is there a floor in there?" she asked. "It's got a bed." "He's taken the bed," she said in a heartbeat. "He's taken the bed," John agreed. She glanced at the things on the ground, then to John, then back to Billy's pale, sweat-slicked face. Billy made a noise just then. It was a tiny, weak sound, holding none of the fight his sister had, and that little sound did what nothing else could. Mary's face just crumpled for 1 second. 1 second where she was 9 years old and worn out and plain terrified, and she had been carrying something too heavy for way too long. Then she pulled herself back together. "All right, Mana," she said. Her voice was just a whisper. "All right, but I'm carrying him." "Fair enough. And I'm not leaving his side. I wouldn't expect you to. And if you try something—" "I know," John said softly. "You've still got the rock." Something shifted in her eyes, not quite what he'd call relief. And it sure wasn't what he'd call trust. But it was in that direction, something small and careful and alive. She settled Billy's weight against her and started toward him. John stepped out of her way. He grabbed the kettle and the blanket and followed a few paces behind her, not crowding her, letting her take the lead. She was wobbling a little under Billy's weight, but she didn't ask for a hand, and he didn't offer one until they got to the cabin door, which she couldn't open with her arms full. "I've got it," he said. She gave him a short, sharp nod. Inside, the cabin's heat was a sudden shock after the bitter cold. The stove had been going since morning, and the little room held its warmth. Mary stepped in and froze. Her eyes darted around, taking in every corner, every surface, every way out. The door, the one window, the loft he used for storing things, mapping it all, filing it away. "Bed's over there," John said, motioning to the narrow frame in the corner. She carried Billy across the floor and laid him on the mattress with a slow care that told him everything about how many times she'd put her brother down quiet-like without waking anyone, without making a noise that would draw the wrong kind of notice. She pulled the blanket to his chin and put her hand on his forehead, and John heard her breath catch. "He's hotter," she said. "The warmth will do that at first, makes it seem worse." He walked to the stove. He added the willow bark to the kettle. "It'll break after he gets something to drink and the medicine has time to get working." Mary stood by the bed, her back to him, both hands clutching the blanket's edge, and she stayed silent. John worked without a word. He'd learned a long while back that silence was its own kind of talk, and that talking at scared things, be it people or animals, didn't do much good. Mostly it made things worse. He let the fire do the talking. Let the warmth fill the room. Let the smell of herbs rise up with the steam. When the tea was steeped, he brought it over and knelt down beside the bed. Billy's eyes were halfway open now, glassy, not focused on anything, but they followed John when he moved. "Hey there, Billy," John said. His voice was gentle and low. "I need you to drink a little of this. Can you manage that for me?" Billy's eyes slid over to his sister. "It's all right," Mary said. Her voice, when she spoke to Billy, was a whole different thing, softer, slower, all the sharp edges gone. "It's all right. This'll help you feel better. Drink it now. Okay?" Billy opened his mouth a little, and John tipped the cup with slow precision. Small sips, with pauses in between, letting the boy swallow without hurrying him. Billy made a face at the bitter taste. "I know," John said. "Tastes awful. Herb medicine always does. You want to know why?" Billy blinked at him. "Because if it tasted any good, folks would drink it just for fun. And then it wouldn't be medicine anymore. It'd be a treat." He kept his voice easy, like they were just visiting. "Can't have that." Billy looked at him for another second, then very soft. "Barely a noise at all. That don't make sense." "No," John agreed. "It sure don't." Something in Mary's stance changed. A tiny bit of the iron seemed to leave her spine, just for a moment. After Billy had taken enough of the tea, his eyes drifted shut again. John stood up and moved back to give Mary her space. She sat on the edge of the bed next to her brother. One hand rested on the blanket over his chest, watching his face. John poured a second cup and put it on the floor next to her. She looked at it, then she looked at him. "That's for you," he said. She didn't touch it right off. John settled in the chair by the stove. Not too close, not blocking her way to the door. And he picked up a piece of harness he'd been meaning to fix for a week. He worked in the quiet, not looking at her, giving her the room to figure out what to do with the cup and the warmth and the man who hadn't yet done what she was waiting for him to do. After a time, she picked up the cup. The fire crackled. Outside, the blizzard howled and shoved at the walls. Billy's breathing, slow and steady over the next hour, eased into something more peaceful. Neither of them said a word for a long stretch. Then Mary spoke without looking up from her brother. "They'll come looking." John kept his hands on the harness. "Who will?" "The men from the county." A beat passed. "Superintendent Dawson. He has papers. He says the papers give him the right to own us." John's hands stopped their work on the leather. For a second. Then he started again. "He says that?" he asked. His voice was level, no pressure in it. "He says it like he's doing us a favor," Mary said flatly. "Says the orphanage is a gift from the state. Says we should be thankful." She said the word thankful like it was something she'd tasted and found spoiled. "Billy stole some bread from the kitchen 3 weeks ago. He was hungry. Dawson put him in the punishment room for 2 days. She paused. It was 40 degrees in that room. John set the harness down. He looked at the fire for a bit, at how the flames moved, steady and without a second thought, burning because that was the only thing a fire knows how to do. "How long have you been running?" he asked. 4 days. She finally looked at him. Those green eyes were level and taking his measure. "We walked, mostly at night. I figured if we could get far enough south, we'd find a place warm enough to—" She trailed off. "Billy got sick on the 3rd day. I didn't know your barn was even here till I smelled the horses." John nodded, slow-like. "You know how to find south?" he asked. "I know how to find the direction the men aren't coming from," she said. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. This 9-year-old girl with haze stuck in her hair and dark hollows carved under her eyes, and a hard-earned wisdom in her face that no 9-year-old should ever have. "You're smart," he said. "I'm tired," she replied. And in those 2 words she said everything. Every night she had stayed awake, every choice she had to make. Every single second, she had to be the one to know what to do, because no one else was there. John reached up and took his coat from its hook by the door. He crossed the room and laid it over her shoulders without touching her, setting it down from above so she felt its weight before anything else. She didn't flinch, but she did look up at him. "You should get some sleep," he said. "I'll keep the fire going. Ain't nobody getting through that storm tonight." "You don't know that." "I know this storm," he said quietly. "I've lived in it for 11 years. You can trust it, even if you won't trust me." She stared at him with those old, exhausted eyes. "I'll stay awake," she said. "I'll wake up if anything." "I know. I'm not." She stopped, swallowed. "I'm not easy to fool twice." "I'm not trying to fool you once," John said. He returned to his chair. He picked up the harness again. "Go on and sleep, Mary. I'll be right here." She didn't sleep for a long while. He knew because he wasn't sleeping either. And he felt every small shift she made, every time her breathing would change, every time she jerked back awake when the wind howled or a log broke in the stove. But somewhere deep in the night, with the blizzard screaming its full rage against the cabin, and Billy's breathing finally deep and even, Mary, 9 years old, 4 days on the run, carrying more than any child should have to carry, finally let go. Her head fell to the edge of the mattress, right beside her brother's shoulder. She finally slept. John kept his post in the chair, the leather harness heavy on his lap. The fire warmed his back while the wind howled outside, throwing everything it had at the small cabin. He stood guard over them all through the dark, endless night. For 7 years he had sworn he was through with this feeling, with letting anyone in. He knew the risk that came when you let yourself care, because he had seen what the world does to the things a man holds dear. But a man can convince himself of almost anything after 11 years of solitude in the high country. And on a night like this, some of those convictions just did not hold up. The dawn arrived quietly, like it always does after a big storm. It was not a bright or clean sunrise, just a slow fading of black into gray, signaling that the night had finally worn itself out. John had not closed his eyes. He stoked the fire 4 different times and held that harness without fixing a single stitch. He just listened. He heard the boys' steady breaths and the girls'. He listened as the storm's rage settled into a tired sigh, the same way fury always burns itself to embers. When Mary woke, it was sudden. No groggy blinking or lazy stretch. Her head lifted from the mattress and her eyes locked onto him in the chair before she even took a second breath. It was sharp, instant, as if sleeping was no different from standing watch. He lifted a hand just a little. Still here, still the same man. Her gaze darted to Billy. The boy's color had returned. That faint blue tint around his mouth was gone, and his small chest rose and fell with the slow, even pace of a truly healing sleep, not just one that killed time. Her shoulders relaxed just a fraction, the first bit of tension she had released since they arrived. "Fever is gone," John said, his voice low. "Broke around 3. Still, she placed the back of her hand on Billy's brow to feel for herself. He could not fault her for that. "Thank you," she said. The words sounded foreign, unused, as if she was not sure what saying them would cost her. "You hungry?" he asked. She gave him that same cautious sizing-up look. "What do you have?" "Cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans if you have got the time, eggs if you do not." Eggs, she decided. He got to cooking without any fuss, keeping his back mostly turned at the stove. It gave her some space to get her bearings, to move around if she felt the need. He could hear her stand up, then the sound of her footsteps heading over to the window to see the snow-covered land. He heard her return. "How far off is the closest town?" she asked. "Dustfall, 4 miles east of here. Is that where Dawson would have gone?" John cracked another egg into the pan. "If he has any sense, and the coin for a room, I would say so. He has plenty of both." She took a chair from the table and sat, placing her hands neatly on the surface. She was not at ease, just holding herself together. He showed up at the orphanage driving a buggy with brass trim. In the dead of winter, when most folks are on horseback, he has a fancy brass buggy. A man like that wants you to know who he is without him saying a word, John noted. Yes. Her reply was simple, as if he had just put a name to something she already knew deep down. He placed the plate before her. For just a heartbeat she looked at it, then she ate with a practiced purpose. It was the way someone eats when they have learned food might not be there tomorrow, not rushed or messy. Just deliberate and sure, like how you drink water after being thirsty long enough to learn its worth. Billy stirred about an hour after. His waking was nothing like his sister's. It was gradual, starting with a soft noise, his eyes blinking at the wooden ceiling in pure bewilderment, until they landed on Mary's face and found their anchor. "Lou?" he whispered, his voice weak and scratchy. "I'm right here," she answered right away, moving to his side. "How are you feeling?" "Thirsty." The boy blinked, and his eyes slid over to John, who was already by the stove, holding a cup. Billy looked him over with the plain, simple curiosity of a 6-year-old. He had not yet learned to carry fear around like his sister did. "Who are you?" the boy asked. "John. This your place?" "It is." Billy thought that over for a moment. "It is warm," he finally said. "Fire tends to do that. Our room at the home was always cold." He stated it like kids do, as a simple fact without any extra feeling, even when the stove was supposed to be on. "Mary used to wrap me up in her coat." Mary's jaw tightened. John walked over with the cup and knelt by the bed. "Here now. Just small sips. Go easy or your stomach will complain." Billy did as he was told, his dark brown eyes watching John over the top of the cup. They were the kind of eyes that soaked everything up without needing to sort it out first. When he was done, he offered the cup back with a very careful and practiced politeness, the sort of manners a boy learns because he knows what happens if he does not use them. "Mr. John," Billy said. "Yeah? You got a mama around here?" The question hung in the quiet room, heavy and still. John felt it hit him, the way only some things can. It was not a sharp pain, just a perfect knowing aim, finding a spot he thought had scarred over years ago. "Not anymore," he answered. Billy gave a serious nod. "Me neither. Mine died when I was real small." He paused. "Mary remembers her more than I do. Mary remembers just about everything." "Billy," Mary said softly, a clear warning in her voice. "I am just telling him." The boy turned his attention back to John. "You got any kids of your own?" John rose to his feet. He took the cup back to the stove. For a long moment he faced away from them, letting the question find its place inside him. Then he turned back and said, "No." His voice was completely steady. Billy took this in with another nod. "That is all right," he said, "with all the grace in the world. You can be a good man even without them." A flicker of something crossed John's face, so small, quick, you could not quite catch it. "I appreciate that, Billy," he said. The day unfolded slowly. The storm had left behind 3 feet of snow, wrapping the world in a blanket of white and quiet. John stepped out 2 times, once to see to the horses, and again to shovel a walkway to the barn. Each time Mary stood at the window, her eyes following his every move until he was back inside. And each time he returned just as he should have. He saw her watching him, but he did not say a thing about it. By afternoon, Billy was strong enough to sit up. Mary allowed herself to settle on the floor by the stove, nursing a tin cup of hot water. She had turned down the tea, claiming it tasted like mud. For a time, the 3 of them just shared the room, the urgency of the crisis gone. What remained was a softer tension, the kind that comes when strangers are feeling each other out. It was Billy who kept the silence at bay. He wanted to know how many horses John owned. He asked if they had names. He asked if the horse with the white spot on its face got the name from John, or if it came that way. He asked if horses enjoyed the snow. "Some do," John replied. "Some do not. It is up to the horse." "What about yours?" "Juniper loves it. Gets frisky in a fresh snow. She will kick up her heels." Rowan, he is not a fan of the cold. He gets to sulking. Billy seemed to think this was the most interesting thing he had ever heard. Horses can sulk? You ever watch a horse turn his back on you and ignore you for 20 minutes, all because you wanted to put a blanket on him? No. Well, that is a horse sulking. Billy let out a laugh. It was a quiet sound, still a bit hoarse from his sickness. But it was genuine. It filled the cabin like a long-lost memory. Mary observed John with the same intensity she gave everything. She was not angry anymore, just watchful, taking his measure. He knew she was doing it and just let her be. After some time passed, she spoke. "How come you have not asked us more?" He glanced up from the boot he was mending. "More about what?" "About our past. About who might be searching for us. About what Dawson plans to do." She cradled the tin cup between her hands, resting her elbows on her knees. Most grown-ups are full of questions. "I reckon you will tell me what is important when you feel you can trust me," John said. "And prying before you are ready is not going to build that trust any faster. It would just satisfy my own curiosity, and that is not reason enough." She sat with that for a second. "Dawson is going to find us," she stated. "Not today. The roads are a mess. But he will, once they are clear. He has got papers," she repeated, and the word itself seemed to weigh on her. "He claims they are from the county, making us wards of the state until we are 18. He says that means we have to go where he wants and do what he tells us. And if we try to run again—" She trailed off and put her cup down. "He threatened to separate us. He said they would send Billy someplace else. So he—" Her tone was level, but her grip on the cup was not. Her knuckles were bone white. "Did he say that right to you?" John's voice was calm, almost too calm. "He said it to the supervisor, but he made sure I was in the hall." She met his eyes. "He wanted me to overhear. It is how he—" She looked for the right word. "It is how he controls all of us." No need for a lock on the door when the person inside is too afraid to leave. John did not answer. He stared down at the boot in his hands, at the needle, the thick thread, and the damaged sole. He thought about a man in a fancy buggy who kept children in line with fear muddle, with a purposeful strength born from their bond. "He ain't taken Billy anywhere," John said. Mary gave him a sharp look, the same way she had with that rock, sizing him up, looking for the catch. "You can't just say things like that," she told him. "I can say what's true." "It's not—" She stopped. When her voice returned, it sounded much older than a 9-year-old's. Older than any age, really. It was the sound of someone who had hope stripped away from them, one hard lesson at a time. People say things, then the papers show up, and what was said don't matter. The papers are all that matters. Men write those papers, John said. And men can be wrong. You can reason with men. You can make them understand that some things just aren't going to happen, no matter what they put on paper. And if they don't understand, he looked right at her, then I'll make it plainer for them. She held his gaze for a long time. This was a girl who learned that hope was a fool's game and trust was a door that only led to trouble. She searched his face and he let her look, letting her see whatever she needed to find. Then she looked away, not like she was giving up, but like she was filing away what she saw, deciding what to do with it later. "Tell me about this town," she said. "Dustfall. What are the folks like?" "It's a mix," John said honestly. "Like any town. Some are good, some aren't. A lot of them just wait to see which way the wind is blowing before they pick the winning side." "Is there anyone—" She trailed off. "Anyone who might help? Not because they were asked to, but just because they wanted to." John's mind went to Margaret Wilson, the solid, steady way she moved through life. How she'd brought him soup after his wife passed on, not making it into a big deal, just a simple fact. You need to eat, and I am here. There was no show to it. She wasn't looking for thanks. Just a practical woman who saw a job that needed doing. "There's a woman," he said. "Margaret Wilson. She runs the boarding house. Got more common sense than half the town put together. And she's been around long enough that people pay attention when she speaks. Does she know about us?" "Not yet." Mary took this in. "When the roads clear up," she said, "Dawson will show. He'll have his papers and his 2 men. He always brings 2 men. She spoke with the tired certainty of someone who knew this all too well. "What are you going to do?" John set the boot on the floor. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "I'm going to open the door," he said, "and I'm going to stand in it. And I'm going to tell him you're not going anywhere." Mary just stared. He saw something flicker behind her eyes, something young and almost scared. But it was a new kind of fear, not the fear of being in danger. This was the fear of wanting something you had long since taught yourself to live without. "Just like that?" she asked. "Just like that. He won't stand for it." "No, I don't suppose he will." John leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Mary, I'm not telling you this will be easy. I'm telling you that when he comes to this door, you and Billy will be on this side of it. That is what I can promise. We'll figure out the rest as it comes." Billy, who'd been listening from the bed, his brown eyes going from one to the other like he was watching a play he didn't quite follow but knew was important, said quietly, "Mary." She looked at him. "I like it here," he said simply. The way he said it, no angle, no argument, just the plain truth from a 6-year-old who knew warmth after being cold for so long, landed with more force than anything else said that day. Mary watched her brother for a second. Then she looked at the fire. Then she met John's eyes, and her face held a look he hadn't seen before. It wasn't quite trust, not all the way, but it was the moment right before it. The point where a person has watched and listened long enough to find a reason not to walk away. "Okay," she said. Her voice was quiet, careful, like a door cracking open just an inch. Outside, the snowfall had ended. The world was still and white, and waiting. Inside the cabin, the fire burned on, and for the first time since he found them, neither child was watching the door. He was, but not with fear. With something much older, something he thought he'd buried in the frozen ground 7 years ago. A purpose. A knock came on Margaret Wilson's door at 4:30 that afternoon. She opened it and saw John Carter on her porch for the first time in 14 months. He held his hat in his hands, snow still on his shoulders, and wore an expression she'd never seen on him in 11 years. He looked like a man who had just made a decision there was no turning back from. "Margaret," he said, "I need your help." She studied him for a long moment. Then she stepped back. "Come on in out of the cold," she said, "and tell me everything." Margaret Wilson listened the way she did everything. Completely, without fidgeting or interrupting, without letting her expression give away her thoughts until he had said his piece. She cupped her coffee mug, kept her eyes on him, and just let him talk. John told her about the barn, about Mary with the rock, Billy's fever, and the willow bark tea. He told her how Mary had said, "That's what they all say," with the flat finality of a child who'd learned that truth the hard way. He told her about Superintendent Dawson, his brass-fitted buggy, and the papers declaring 2 children were state property until they turned 18. He told her about the punishment room that stayed at 40 degrees in January. He told her all of it plain, because Margaret didn't need it dressed up. She just needed the facts. She would sort them out herself. When he was done, the only sound was the fire. Margaret set down her cup. She looked at the table for a second, the way a person does when they are lining up their thoughts. "How old is she?" she asked. "9. "And the boy?" "6. Margaret gave a single slow nod. "And they've been at the county home for how long?" Mary didn't say for sure. Long enough that Billy doesn't recall any other place. Margaret's jaw tightened just a bit. She had a face made for keeping things in, broad and steady, a face that had seen enough of life's troubles to not be easily shocked. But her jaw tightened, and John saw it. "Dawson's been running that place for 6 years, she said. "I've heard whispers. Nothing I could ever pin down. Nothing anyone would say out loud where it mattered. Just whispers. She looked up at him. There are 3 families in town with children from that home working on their farms. I used to tell myself it was better than the street. She paused. I might have been wrong about that. Margaret, John started. I'm not getting worked up, John. I'm taking stock. She said it sharply, her usual way. What do you need from me? I need someone who understands the county's business, who to see, and if there's any legal path that won't end with Dawson leading those kids out of a courthouse. There might be. She stood and walked to the small desk in the corner, opening a drawer with the ease of a woman who has known where everything is for 30 years. She pulled out a folded paper and brought it to the table. Judge Alderman passes through Dustfall the 3rd week of every month. He's not a kind man, but he is an honest one, which is rarer and a sight more useful. If you were to file for custody before Dawson gets his hearing, if you were already on the record as someone interested in the children's well-being, I've only known them 2 days. Doesn't matter. She sat down again. The law doesn't care how long you've known a person. It cares about their situation and your ability to offer something better. She folded her hands on the paper. John, do you want these children? He'd been expecting the question. He'd been wrestling with it since about 2 in the morning, sitting in his chair with the leather harness in his lap. Billy's quiet breathing in his ears and Mary's face there every time he shut his eyes. That face. 9 years old and ancient in all the ways a child should not be. I want them safe, he said. That is not what I asked you. He looked at her. Margaret looked right back. She'd known him long enough not to let him sidestep the one thing that truly mattered. Yes, he said. The word was quieter than he expected, as if saying it gave it a weight it didn't have before. Margaret nodded once, as if that settled it. Then this is what you're going to do. She talked for 20 minutes straight. John listened just as she had, completely and without a word. She knew the clerk at the county office in Cheyenne and the name of the lady who actually made the filing system work, no matter whose name was on the sign. She knew Dawson's power was administrative, not from a court, meaning a judge could overrule him if there was a documented alternative with a willing person. She knew the territorial child welfare law had a rule for emergency placement, one that skipped the normal waiting period if the judge saw a good enough reason, modeled here. She also knew, because Margaret Wilson made it her business to know what was what, that Richard Dawson was in the habit of coming into Dustfall and going directly to Sheriff Dowd, who was a man with a flimsy backbone and a strong sense of his own interests, and that if Dawson got to Dowd before John got to the alderman's clerk, their legal ground would crumble. The roads ought to be passable come tomorrow afternoon, Margaret said. Dawson will know that too. Then I have to move before him. You have to move tonight. She stood up, smoothing her apron. I'll write a letter to the alderman's clerk. My name means something there. I've done her mother's wash for 15 years, and I sat with her when her husband ran off. People remember kindness when it's the sort that has a cost to it. She moved to the stove and put a second kettle on. You go on back to those children, keep them steady. Don't tell Mary too much. She'll want to put up a fight, and right now a fight is not the way. The way is paper and patience and letting me handle the parts I know how to handle. She's not going to like that answer, John said. No, she's going to flat out hate it. Margaret didn't look up from what she was doing. She's been running things on her own for Lord knows how long. Being told to let another soul carry some of that weight will feel like she's losing her footing. You'll have to show her the difference between trusting someone and just giving up. 'Cause for a kid who's never had any say, those two feel about the same. John settled his hat back on his head. He watched Margaret for a second, this steady, patient woman who saw what needed doing and just did it. No fanfare needed. Much obliged, he said. She just waved a hand, already busy writing. Go on home to your children, John. He paused there at the door. She didn't say those children. She said your children. He let it lie. He just stepped out into the biting cold. Dawson showed up the next morning. John spotted them from the window while the coffee was still brewing. 3 riders coming up from the east, moving at a steady gait. Not hurried, not wary. Just the pace of men who figure they belong wherever they're headed. Dawson was in the middle, still wearing that gray coat despite the chill. The 2 men on his flanks were bigger, with the empty faces of fellas hired to look tough while another man talks. Billy was still at the table, finishing up the last of his grits. Mary had been staring out that same window for the better part of an hour. "That's him," she said. Her voice was flat, solid, and John could hear every single wall she'd ever built going up inside her. "I know." John stood and pulled on his coat. "Mary, you listen to me now." She turned from the window. Her face was a mask, but her hands were down by her sides, and he could see her knuckles were white. "You stay in here with Billy," he told her. "Both of y'all. Don't you come to that door less I call for you. You understand me?" "He's going to bring up the papers," she said. "Let him. You don't know what he's like. Mary." He said it calm and low, holding her gaze. "I've been dealing with men like Richard Dawson since before you were born. I know exactly what he's like. I need you to let me handle this at the door. Can you do that for me?" She just looked at him with those green eyes, and he could see the war going on in them. The part of her that learned to trust nobody was fighting with a newer, smaller part that had sat by his fire for 2 days, eaten his food, and watched him be gentle with her brother. "If he says a word about... He won't get far enough to say much of anything," John promised. "Stay with Billy." A muscle jumped in her jaw. Then she gave a nod, quick, sharp, and reluctant. John stepped onto the porch. The cold was a shock after the cabin's warmth. He pulled the door shut behind him, stood on his porch, and just waited. He wasn't going to walk out to meet them. He'd make them come to him on his land. Dawson reined in about 10 yards out and dismounted with the slow care of a man who did things proper, not easy. He smoothed his coat, set his hat just so, and walked on up with his hands loose at his sides. He wasn't reaching for a thing because he didn't have to. He had the papers. In his mind, that was the only weapon worth a damn. "Mr. Harding," he said. His voice was smooth, schooled. The voice of a man used to people listening. "I'm Superintendent Richard Dawson from the County Welfare Administration. I do believe you have some county property here." "Well, I got a horse, 2 mules, a few chickens, and about $40 worth of fence posts," John said. "Nothing that belongs to the county." Dawson offered a patient smile, the kind of smile a man gives when he's had this talk before and finds it a little tiresome. "I'm speaking of 2 juvenile wards under the county's protective care who went missing from the home about 6 days ago." He reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "I have a recovery order right here issued by the county clerk. I'm authorized to collect these children and return them to the home." John eyed the document but made no move to take it. "Authorized by who now?" he asked. "The county clerk, as I said, the Territorial Welfare Board." "The county clerk is just a man with a pen," John said flatly. "He signs whatever's put in front of him. That's not an order from a judge." Something flickered in Dawson's face. That patient smile hung on, but something behind his eyes shifted. "Mr. Harding, I understand your feelings here, I surely do. You found 2 children in a bad spot and you gave them a hand. That's a fine thing, but these children are wards of the state. Their well-being is the county's legal duty. And my job is to..." "Your job," John cut in, "is exactly what I'd like to talk about." Dawson fell silent. John kept his voice easy, like they were just passing the time. "The way you talk when you want a man to hear every last word. I know about the punishment room. I know it gets down to 40 degrees in there in January. I know you put a 6-year-old boy in there for 2 days for taking bread because he was hungry. He let that hang in the air. I know you told a 9-year-old girl right where she could hear you that if she ran off again, you'd split them up for good. Use the love between them like a lock on a cage." He tilted his head just a bit. "I'm just wondering which part of the territorial welfare laws covers that kind of child management." Dawson's pleasant look had frozen on his face. "Those are some mighty serious accusations," he said. "They're not accusations," John answered. "They're just what happened, and there's a world of difference." One of the men behind Dawson shifted his feet. The other one stood like a statue. "Mr. Harding." Dawson's voice was different now, still measured, but the friendliness was gone, replaced by something hard and sharp. "I'm going to be plain with you. I have a legal order. You are right now in violation of territorial law by harboring county wards. If you fail to produce those children in the next—" The cabin door creaked open. John heard it behind him and felt his jaw clench, because he'd told her to stay inside and she'd clearly decided his words had an expiration date. But it wasn't Mary who came out. It was Billy. He stepped out wearing his coat, which was still way too big and slid off one shoulder. He walked right to the edge of the porch, stood there next to John, and stared at Dawson with those dark brown eyes that didn't have Mary's fire in them. But he had something else. A simple, clear-eyed kind of steadiness. The way little kids sometimes look at things they don't know enough to be scared of yet. "You're Mr. Dawson," Billy said. Dawson just looked at him. A little flicker crossed his face. He shut it down fast, but it was there. "Hello, William." "You're the one who put me in the cold room," Billy stated. It wasn't an accusation, just him saying it plain, like he said most things, just stating a fact he knew to be true. "I was hungry. Mary said I wasn't supposed to take the bread, but I was awful hungry." He stopped for a second. "I didn't like that cold room." Dawson didn't say a word. "Mr. John, he doesn't have a cold room," Billy went on. His voice was still even and calm. "Just a child telling the world like he saw it. He made me tea when I was sick. It tasted real bad, but he told me why. He said it had to taste bad, otherwise it wouldn't be medicine." Billy glanced at John, checking his memory, then looked back at Dawson. "I think I'd rather stay here." The quiet that followed was so thick you could feel it. John felt the two fellas behind Dawson look at each other. He could hear the leather creak when they shifted, and he felt Dawson making up his mind right there in that moment. Doing the math again, rethinking his play. Then Mary came and stood in the doorway. She didn't step out on the porch, just stood in the frame with her hands planted on either side. And she gave Dawson a look John had never seen on her before. Not the hard-as-nails look from the barn. Not the careful sizing-up look she'd had for 2 days. This was new. It was a look that had walked right through fear and come out the other side, where you get to after being scared for so long the fear just burns itself out, leaving something harder and purer behind. "If you take us back," Mary said, "I'll tell Judge Alderman about your cold room. I'll tell him about the Tyler boy who came back from the Ferris farm last spring with a busted wrist, and how you told the supervisor to just write it down that he fell. I'll tell him about every kid you farmed out to every ranch in this county, and how hard they worked and how little money they ever saw." Her voice was solid as a rock. "I've been keeping a list, names and dates. I can't write it down yet, but I remember it all, every last thing." Dawson stared at her. John stared at her. Even the two men with Dawson were staring at her. She was 9 years old, standing in a doorway in Wyoming in the middle of February, and she was the calmest one on that whole porch. Dawson's face went through a whole mess of expressions before it settled back into that controlled look of a man who figured children didn't have a voice or any fight in them. He was learning different right then and there, and he surely didn't like the price of the lesson. He folded the paper real slow and tucked it back in his coat. "Mr. Harding," he said, and his voice was changed now, softer, like the feel of the air before a storm. "You've gone and put yourself in a real bind here." "Been in a bind before," John said, "and I'm still here." Dawson held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at Billy, then at Mary in the doorway. "The county owns these children, Mr. Harding." He buttoned his coat with slow, deliberate movements. "Not you. Not yet." He turned and walked back to his horse. His two men followed him without a word. He got on that horse with the same careful way he did everything. Once he was up, he looked back just one time. Not at John. At Mary. Whatever he saw in her face made him turn his head away for good. They rode east and didn't look back, and the snow covered their tracks almost as fast as they laid them down. John just stood on the porch till they were clean out of sight. Then he turned around. Billy had grabbed his hand sometime in that last minute. John hadn't even felt it happen. He just found it there. Little fingers wrapped tight around two of his, holding on with the simple trust of a kid who's decided this is a good hand to hold. He looked down at the boy. Billy looked up. "Did we win?" he asked. John thought about what Margaret had said, about Judge Alderman and the county clerk and the paperwork and the woman whose mother's laundry she'd done for 15 years. He thought about those two words, "not yet," and all the fight packed inside him. "Not yet," he said, honest as he could be. "But we're still standing." Mary stepped off the porch and stood right in front of him. She tilted her head back to look up at his face with those green eyes of hers. For the first time since the barn, she looked exactly like what she was, a 9-year-old girl who was bone-tired and scared to death and trying with all her might not to let it show. "He'll come back with a court order," she said. "He might at that," John said. "Then we'd best be ready." He looked at her, at how she was already thinking about the next play, already sizing up the next danger, already doing the figuring that had kept her and Billy alive for 4 days in a Wyoming blizzard. "Mary," he said, his voice low. She looked up. "That was real brave," he said. "What you did back there in the doorway, that took some grit." Something in her face shifted. It didn't get soft exactly. She wasn't made of soft stuff, not now, and maybe never would be. But something loosened, some tight knot deep inside her that had been there since before he'd even found her in that barn, maybe since before she even had words for what she was carrying. She swallowed hard. "I meant it," she said. "Every word. I remember it all." "I know you do," John told her, "and we're going to use every bit of it." Billy squeezed John's fingers, his steady brown eyes looking back and forth between them. The cold pushed in from every direction, and the road east where Dawson had gone was just empty and white and quiet. Inside the cabin, a fire was still going. Margaret showed up the next morning before the sun had made up its mind to rise. She got there the way she did everything, with no fuss and no show, carrying a covered pot that smelled like onions and salt pork, and that special kind of warmth that comes from someone who cooks for folks, because feeding them is the plainest way she knows to say they matter. She put the pot on John's stove, looked at the two kids at the table and said who she was the same way she did with everybody, plain and simple, looking right at them instead of talking over their heads to John. "I'm Margaret Wilson," she said to Mary. "I run the boarding house in town. Your name is Mary." Mary gave her that familiar sizing-up look. "How'd you know that?" "John told me." Margaret sat down right across from her. "He also told me you're 9 years old, and you've been taking care of things by yourself for longer than any 9-year-old ought to. I'm not here to take over. I'm here to help." She set a folded piece of paper on the table and slid it over to Mary. "That's my letter to Judge Alderman's court clerk. I've asked for an emergency hearing to be set before Dawson can file his own papers. You know what that means?" Mary looked at the paper, then back at Margaret. "It means we get to the judge before he does. That's it exactly." Margaret's face didn't show any surprise or praise. She just nodded her head like that was the answer she figured she'd get. "You catch on fast." "I have to," Mary said. "Yes," Margaret said simply. "I reckon you do." She looked over at Billy, who was watching her with that direct, open curiosity he had about everything. "And you must be Billy." "Yes, ma'am," Billy said. "How are you feeling?" "Better." He thought on it a second. "Mr. John's tea tastes awful, but it works. Most things that work well ain't exactly sweet." Margaret said, and the way she said it was half a joke and half the gospel truth. Billy seemed to figure it was funny enough and gave a little smile into his cup. John stood by the stove and listened to Margaret lay out the whole plan in clear, steady words. The hearing could happen within the week if the clerk moved fast, and Margaret was sure she would. The felon needed three main things: someone willing to make a proper claim to take care of them, proof of the bad conditions at the county home to show neglect, and testimony. Mary's testimony, most of all, if she was up to it. Testimony just means saying out loud in a room what you told me on the porch, John explained, looking at Mary. Mary met his eyes. With Dawson right there? More than likely, yes. She was quiet for a bit. You could see her working through it. It moved across her face like a storm cloud passing over the prairie. Nothing hidden, just a person wrestling with a hard choice right out in the open. Good, she said. Margaret looked at her for a beat too long, and John saw something on Margaret's face he didn't see often. A feeling she chose not to say out loud because some things are meant to be seen, not said. They spent that morning going over all of it. Margaret had a practical, orderly way of getting ready that reminded John of how his pa used to handle hard things, not by pretending they were small, but by chopping them into bite-sized pieces and tackling each one till the job was finished. She had Mary tell her everything she could remember about the county home, not to get emotional, but just to get the facts straight. Who, what, when, names, every little detail. The Tyler boy with the busted wrist. The three little ones who worked sunup to sundown at the Ferris farm and came back too worn out to even eat. The record book the supervisor kept that Mary had read upside down from the office window while doing chores and memorized because she knew it mattered, even then, because that information was the only coin she had to spend. Mary talked for nearly an hour. Margaret wrote it all down in the neat, careful script of a woman who'd kept ledgers her entire life, never once asking Mary to repeat a thing, never even blinking at what she heard. Billy drifted off to sleep on the bed in the corner about halfway through, his small chest rising and falling with the steady breath of a child who was finally, truly safe enough to rest. When Mary had no more to say, Margaret put her pen down. She studied the pages before her. Then she looked straight at Mary. "You're going to be all right," she said. It wasn't comfort, it was a fact. Mary just looked back at her. "You can't know that." "No," Margaret allowed. "But I've been around long enough to know what makes it and what don't. And I know what I'm seeing right here." She gathered up her papers and folded them just so. "I'll get these to the clerk before dark. John has to file his own claim at the county office tomorrow morning before Dawson gets there. That means before 8 o'clock. I'll be there at 7 o'clock, John said. She gave a single nod. She stood, put on her coat, and took one last look around the cabin. At the warm fire, at the sleeping boy, at Mary, who was still at the table with her hands clasped and her jaw set tight. Something passed over her face, quick and real. "This is a good room," she said, her voice low. Not about the wood or the chairs, but about the spirit in it. Then she was out the door and the cabin fell back into its own kind of quiet. That night, long after Billy was asleep, Mary sat on the floorboards by the stove. It had sort of become her spot these last few days, not the chair or the bed, but the floor near the warmth, with her knees pulled up, like some part of her wasn't quite ready to claim furniture that wasn't hers. John sat in his chair and let her be. After some time passed, she finally spoke. "What if the judge takes Dawson's side?" "He could," John answered. She looked over at him. "You always do that." "Do what?" "You answer the real question, instead of trying to make me feel better. Would you rather I just made you feel better?" She considered it for a moment, the way she did with most things. "No," she said. "I've had folks try to make me feel better plenty of times. It never did match up with what happened next." She hugged her knees a little tighter. "I just need to know what we do if it all goes wrong." John leaned forward then, resting his elbows on his knees. "If the alderman rules against us, I'll file an appeal up in Cheyenne. That'll buy us some time. A few weeks, maybe longer. While that's going on, Margaret knows a lawyer over in Laramie who handles child welfare cases. She's already mailed him a letter." Mary just stared at him. When did she manage that? I'd say last night. She mailed out 2 letters, one for the clerk and another for that lawyer. She kept it to herself this morning. Figured she shouldn't load you down with backup plans before we see if the first one works. Mary was quiet for a second. She thinks just like me, she said. How do you mean? Always 2 steps ahead. Always another door behind the first one. She took a breath. At the home, I used to plan things out the same way. If breakfast is short, do this. If the supervisor shows up early, do that. If Dawson himself came, well, that plan had the most parts. Her voice had trailed off, getting softer and more distant. I made Billy learn parts of the plans, too, just in case. He didn't rightly understand them, but he did it because I told him to. John didn't say a word, he just let her speak. He never complained, not once, Mary said. Not about any of it. The cold, the hard work, the way some of the farm folks talked down to us, he just kept on keeping on. Her voice hitched on those last words, like a string pulled too tight. He is only 6. He's not supposed to know how to do that yet. No, John agreed, he should not. She watched the fire. If this does not pan out, she paused, then tried again. If it does not pan out and they try to send us back, you have to promise me something. What is it? Do not let them split us up. She turned then and looked right at him. All that careful calm she held was stripped away to its raw center. Not the 9-year-old girl who planned 2 steps ahead. Not the one with the rock out in the barn. Just a little girl asking the only question that was more important than all the others. No matter what happens, do not let them send Billy to a different place. John met her gaze for a good long while. He thought on promises, what they cost a man, what they were truly worth, and what it meant to give one to a child who had been taught the hard way that promises were just where hope went to die. I promise you, he said, whatever it takes. She studied his face and seemed to find what she was searching for. She gave a small nod, turned back to the fire, and did not say another word. And the quiet that fell between them felt different than all the times before. It was lighter, as if they had both agreed to set down a heavy burden, and neither one had to pick it up again. The county office unlocked its doors at 8 o'clock, and John was standing there at 6:55. The clerk was a skinny fella named Garrett, with ink-stained hands and the slightly stunned look of a man always surprised the world still needed him to do things. He took John's paperwork with an expression that said he knew just what it was and who it was about to make mad. Mr. Dawson was in here yesterday evening, Garrett said quietly. I figured he might have been, John replied. He filed for a recovery. Well, now we have filed against it, and the judge can pick which one to hear first. John pushed the papers over the counter. Margaret Wilson sent her own request for an emergency hearing. She said you would know what to do with it. Garrett glanced at the papers. He glanced at John. He reached under the counter and grabbed his stamp, moving with the tired know-how of a man who understood that a request from Margaret Wilson was bound to turn into something big. I will have it on the judge's schedule before noon, he said. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days later. Those 3 days passed in a way that was different from all the days before. The urgency had taken on a new shape. The trouble was no longer a sudden emergency like a fever or a blizzard with men at the door. It was a deeper kind of waiting, one that had teeth. Mary poured all her energy into getting ready because for her, being still was like losing the fight. She and Margaret practiced her story twice every day. She had to correct Margaret on 2 dates and a name. She asked about how the court worked, wanting to understand the rules of a game she was already forced to play. Billy, being 6 years old, was mostly untouched by the tension. He helped John feed the horses in the morning and decided that Juniper was his favorite and Rowan was just misunderstood. He ate every bite of food given to him. He slept sound and deep. He followed John around the barn like a little shadow, the way a kid does when he finds a grown-up he trusts and plans to stick close. On the second afternoon, with Mary at Margaret's place going over her words, John was in the barn. As he checked Juniper's hoof with Billy watching, the boy asked, still looking at the horse, "Are you going to be our papa?" John set the hoof down real gentle. He stood up and turned to look at Billy, who had asked the question as plainly as he asked about everything. There was no trick to it, no scheme, just a child wanting to know something. "I do not know yet," John said. "The judge is going to help us figure that out." Billy thought about this for a second. "What do you want?" The question hit John just as hard as when Mary had asked if he wanted them. It was direct, honest, and carried more weight than questions 3 times its size. "I want you and Mary to be in a place that is safe and warm," John said. "A place where nobody locks you in a cold room because you are hungry. A place where someone knows your name and says it kindly." "That is here," Billy said simply. John looked at the boy, at the hay in his golden hair and the serious look on his little face. He saw those dark eyes that could find the simple truth in things, without all the complications adults build around them. "Yeah," John said, "that is here." Billy nodded, satisfied, and turned his attention back to Juniper. "I am going to tell the judge that Rowan pouts," he said, "so he will know you are a real person." John opened his mouth, then he closed it. "That might just help," he said after a moment. On the morning of the hearing, Margaret came to the cabin early. She helped Mary with her hair and her coat and said nothing sentimental because Mary did not want that. She wanted to be prepared. John put on his best shirt and his cleanest hat. Margaret looked the hat over and, after a silent moment of judgment, handed it back to him without a word. He left it on the hook. The courthouse was a single room used for court, town meetings, and sometimes church, depending on the week. The room smelled like wood smoke and old paper. There were 12 people in the seats when they walked in. John had not expected 12. He thought maybe Margaret and Garrett would come and whoever Dawson brought. He knew 3 of the faces from town, the Hendersons from the feed store, old Pete Marsh from the stables, Clara Webb, who owned the dry goods store and was known for keeping her opinions to herself until her mind was made up. And then, nothing on earth could move her. They were not there because he had asked them. He had not asked anybody. Margaret had. She did not say a word about it when she stood beside him. She just looked at the crowd and then at him with the look of a woman who did what was needed and did not require any talk about it. Mary saw the people too. She stood still for a second in the doorway, taking it all in, studying the faces, reading the room the way she read everything. Then she straightened her shoulders, walked inside, and took the seat Margaret showed her. Dawson came in with his 2 men and a lawyer, a smooth-talking man from Cheyenne. He put his leather case on the table with authority and started arranging his papers, putting on a show for everyone. Dawson himself looked at John across the room, his face perfectly controlled and impossible to read. It was the look of a man who knew not to show his cards until the game started. Billy sat between John and Margaret, swinging his feet because they could not reach the floor. He looked around the room with wide, curious eyes like it was all a grand adventure. Judge Alderman came in 3 minutes before the hour and sat down without any ceremony, like a man who did not waste time. He was older than John had figured, with a white beard and eyes the color of gray flint. He looked over the room once before opening his book as if he was counting things only he could see. "We are here about 2 different filings for 2 children, Mary and William, who are wards of the county under the supervision of Superintendent Richard Dawson," Alderman said, getting right to it. He sounded like a man who had heard too many of these stories and wanted this one handled properly. "And a counter-request for emergency custody filed by one John Carter of this county." He looked up from the book. "Mr. Dawson, you will speak first, then Mr. Harding." His eyes shifted to Mary, who sat straight and still in her chair. "And then we will hear from the young lady herself, if she is willing." Mary's chin lifted a little. "I am willing," she said. Dawson's lawyer stood up and started talking, using the exact words Mary had warned them about. They were careful, reasonable words like welfare and provision and the structured environment needed for children. Words that sounded like kindness but were really about control. John listened to every single word. He watched Dawson's face while his lawyer talked, and he watched Mary across the aisle, so still and controlled, holding everything she knew inside. He felt Billy's small shoulder against his arm, warm and real. When Dawson's lawyer finished and sat down, pleased with himself, John stood up. He was not a man who gave speeches, he never had been. He stood, looked Judge Alderman in the eye, and told the plain truth in plain words. He told him what he found in his barn, the shape they were in, and what they had told him about the cold room and being rented out for labor. He talked about using a 6-year-old boy's suffering as a tool to control others. He spoke for 7 minutes. He did not add his own opinions, and he did not put on a show. When he finished, he sat down. Alderman looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Dawson. Dawson's face was carefully blank. His lawyer leaned close and whispered something. "The girl," Alderman said. "Mary." Mary stood. She smoothed her coat with both hands, a small, quick gesture you make when you are nervous but do not want to show it. Then she folded her hands, looked at the judge, and began to speak. She did not look at Dawson. She did not need to. She spoke for 11 minutes. She gave names, dates, told them about the Tyler boy, the record book, the 3 children at the Ferris farm. She spoke with a flat, certain voice, like someone who had been gathering the facts her whole life, and her voice stayed steady through it all. It broke just once for a single moment when she said, "He told me they would separate us." Her voice caught on the word separate, and then she went on. The room was completely silent. When she finished, she sat down. Billy immediately grabbed her hand under the table. She did not look at him, but her fingers wrapped tightly around his. Alderman had been writing. He finished a line, put down his pen, and looked at Dawson over his book. His flint-colored eyes belonged to a man who had listened closely and had made up his mind. "Mr. Dawson," he said, "I have some questions." Alderman's questions were not kind. He asked them in the same flat, even voice. But now there was a hardness underneath it, like a stone that has been in cold water for a long time. He asked Dawson about the punishment room, about how long William was kept inside and what the temperature was. He asked about the work deals with the Ferris farm and the Henderson place and 2 other ranches. John did not know the names, but he watched Dawson's lawyer write them down quickly, like a man trying to measure the damage in real time. Dawson answered carefully. He used words like corrective environment and structured consequence and mutually beneficial work experience. His tone never lost its pleasant edge. His hands never moved from the table. It was clear he had answered tough questions in tough rooms before and figured that his fancy words were all the armor he needed. Alderman allowed him to finish every answer without interruption before he asked another question. He gave no sign of what he was thinking about any of it. He just wrote and asked and wrote some more. And the room was still around him, the way a room gets still when every person in it knows something important is being settled. Dawson's lawyer spoke up twice. He made objections using the careful words of a man trying to protect his client. And both times Alderman gave him a quick look and said, "Noted," before moving on. When he was done with his questions, Alderman put his pen down and surveyed the room. He looked at Dawson and his lawyer. He looked at John. He looked at Margaret, who had not budged or changed her expression since it all started. He looked at Mary, who still sat with her back ramrod straight, holding Billy's hand under the table. Her eyes were locked on the judge with the sharp focus of someone who had learned how to see how things would end before they were ever spoken out loud. The judge glanced at his ledger, then he spoke. "This court finds good reason to pause the county order while we investigate that county home," he said. "Effective now, the children, Mary and William, will be placed with John Carter, pending a welfare check in 60 days. He looked at Dawson. "Mr. Dawson, this court is ordering a full audit of your business, your practices, and your books, including all labor deals. You are advised to get them ready." Dawson's lawyer leaned in to whisper. Dawson listened. For the first time, his face showed something other than control. Just for a second, just enough to be real. "Your Honor," the lawyer started. "My ruling is made," Alderman said, closing the ledger. He scanned the room one last time, his eyes landing on Billy, who had been kicking his feet for the last 40 minutes straight. A flicker of something changed in the judge's hard, tired eyes. "Court is adjourned." The sound in the room was not loud. It was the sound of a held breath being released by all. 12 people letting go of the tension of caring about something they could not control. Mary did not move for 3 seconds. John saw it on her face, the same process he had seen all week, her hunt for the catch, for the fine print that turns a good thing bad. She searched for the trap fast and deep, and found nothing. There was nothing left but the truth. Billy looked up at her. "Mary," he asked, "did we win?" Her throat worked. Her eyes shimmered, and she pressed her lips tight, holding it in until she knew it was safe. Then she said softly, "Yeah, Billy, we won." The boy processed this. He turned to John with the great seriousness of someone with a heavy secret. "I did not tell the judge about Rowan," he said. John looked at him. "How come?" "I forgot." Billy looked troubled for a moment. "You think it would have helped?" "I think we did fine," John said, his voice rougher than he wanted. He cleared it. "Come here, you two." He did not wait, but crossed the room himself. He put a hand on Billy's shoulder and looked at Mary, who looked right back. Then she did a new thing. She stepped in and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her forehead to his chest and just holding on. He held her back. He held her like you hold someone who has been through too much and just needs to be held, no questions asked. Billy squeezed in from the side with the simple need of a 6-year-old joining a hug meant for him, too. John felt them both against him, the solid warmth of 2 kids who had been cold too long. And something in his chest, locked tight for 7 solitary winters, broke open so fast he had to stand still to keep his balance. Margaret passed them and touched his arm as she went by. Just her hand on his sleeve. 2 seconds. No words. But he understood it all. Dawson left without a word to anyone. His lawyer followed, briefcase in tow. The 2 men from the cabin went after them. The courthouse door shut with an ordinary click that was more final than any grand exit. The 12 people in the seats lingered. Some spoke to Margaret. Some gave John an awkward, sincere look, wanting to say something but not sure if he wanted to hear it. Old Pete Marsh just came over and shook John's hand. John shook it back. It was enough. Clara Webb knelt by Billy and asked his name. He told her. She said it was a fine name, and he agreed. Mary stood beside John through it. Not behind him, not in front, just there, present, taking in the town with those careful green eyes. John could see the tension in her shoulders slowly changing. Not leaving. It was too deep set for that. Too much a part of her, but shifting. The tension of a threat was becoming the tension of new ground. A different, lighter weight to carry. On the ride back, Billy was asleep on Mary's arm in minutes. The cold had eased some. Still February. Still Wyoming. But it was a quiet cold, no longer trying to make a point. The sky was a still white. John drove the wagon slow. Mary watched the white fields pass. Then she said, 60 days for the review. That is it, John said. And after? If things are in order, they will make it permanent. He paused. Margaret knows what they look for. She will help us. Mary was quiet. What does in order mean? That you have got food and a roof. That someone is looking out for you. That you are not in danger. He glanced at her. We do not have those problems. She thought about that. Billy stirred and she shifted to steady him, one arm moving, up to steady him without looking. They're going to investigate Dawson, she said. The audit. Right. The other kids are still in that place. The words hit with all the force she intended. John heard her and knew this wasn't some idea she was talking about. He could tell she was picturing real faces, remembering specific names, the children she'd lived with before she took off running. And running away had cost her dearly in a way she'd kept to herself. Yes, he said, they are. And the words you spoke in that courtroom are the beginning of fixing it all. His voice was even and true. It is not going to be quick. These things never are. But it is on the record now. Alderman is not the kind of man to forget something he has heard. And Margaret is not the kind of woman to let something go until it is finished. He met her gaze. You set something in motion today, Mary. Something that is bigger than just you and Billy. She turned to face him, her expression one he had never seen. Not her calculating look, not her guarded one, not the bone-deep weariness she always seemed to have. This was something new, a look that was sorting through what he had just told her. It held the faint, careful start of the idea that something she had done had actually mattered. She turned her eyes back to the road. In that room, I kept thinking about all my plans to get out, she said, and how every single one failed. Then I thought about why this one worked, and I could not figure out what made it different. And what did you come up with, John asked. She stayed silent for a second. That I had help this time, she said. She said it plainly, without any feeling. It was just a conclusion she had reached and was stating as fact. Every other time it was all on me. I am good at making plans, but I am also just 9. She took a small breath. This time I had Margaret and you and even Billy on the porch. And it worked. She paused one more time. I'm starting to think that is the key. That things go better when folks are, she searched for the word, connected. John gave a slow nod. Did your mother teach you that? Mary's expression flickered. She taught me to remember, she said. I figured out the rest by myself. She glanced over at Billy, who was still asleep. She would always say, You take care of your brother, Mary, every single night, as if it were the most vital thing she could tell me before the day was over. A muscle twitched in her jaw. I always figured that meant protecting him from other people. I am starting to think she also meant protecting him from being all alone. I reckon those are 2 different things. They are, John said. They are tied together, but they are not the same. Yeah. She stared out at the white landscape again. I believe I am beginning to see that. They rode on without a word for a little while. The wagon creaked along steadily on the snow-covered road. The cabin appeared up ahead. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney where Margaret had banked the coals before they went out. It was a small, thoughtful gesture from a woman who always planned ahead and made certain a warm welcome was waiting. Billy woke up right as the wagon halted. He was blinking and looking around, lost for a moment. Then his eyes found Mary beside him, and he was fine. He looked at the cabin. He looked at John. Are we home? He asked. The word just hung there in the cold air. John tied off the reins and put on the brake. His eyes on the cabin, the patched-up wall on the north side, the shutters he had put back up last October, the door frame he had touched every time he left for 11 years without fully understanding why. He thought of a woman who had passed away in the county's single bed during a winter so cold they could not dig a proper grave, and all the things he had locked away inside himself afterward and called living. He thought about 2 candles, one for those the winter took, one for those it spared. Yeah, he said, we're home. Billy hopped down from the wagon without any fuss and sprinted for the cabin door with the pure confidence of a boy who had found his place and needed to prove it right then and there. Mary got down slower, her feet landing softly in the snow. She stood a moment just looking at the cabin with an expression that was working through something complicated and personal. John walked around the wagon to stand with her. You doing all right? He asked. She drew a breath. She let it go. The cold air turned it into a white cloud that drifted up and vanished. She watched it disappear. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. She said it softly. I know that does not make any sense. I know that is not what is happening. But I have been on edge since the judge made his ruling. It will not be taken back, John said. You can't know that, Mary. He spoke her name just like he had in the cabin the morning Dawson showed up. Calm. No force to it. Like a hand holding a door open instead of trying to shove it. I know things can be taken. I understand how that feels. I have lost things. He paused for a moment. But I also know the difference between something real and something that is not. What happened in court today was real. What you and Billy have got here is real. I am not promising that hard times will never come around again. I am promising that this will not be taken from you. She looked up at him. Her face, in the pale February sun, was still the face of a child who had witnessed too much, who had shouldered too much, who had been forged by the relentless pressure of a life that never asked for her consent. All of that remained. A part of it probably always would. Some things leave marks that never quite go away, and that is just the way of it. But something new was there too, sprouting up carefully next to the old resilience, green and uncertain, like a new plant pushing through frozen soil, slow and against the grain, but growing all the same. She set her shoulders back. "Okay," she said. It was the same word she used that first night when she allowed Billy to rest on the bed. Still cautious. Still one step at a time, but with more strength behind it now than there was back then. She went up to the cabin door. Inside, she and Billy had a small argument, but with no real anger about who was the bigger help. During the hearing, Billy insisted his very presence had provided crucial character evidence about John for the judge, while Mary countered that giving testimony was not the same as just sitting there and kicking your feet. John wisely stayed out of it and put a kettle on to boil. Margaret showed up an hour later carrying a pie she had baked the night before because Margaret Wilson never left things to fate if she could prepare for them instead. She placed it on the table and sliced 4 big pieces without a word, and Billy instantly declared it the greatest thing he had ever tasted. Margaret accepted this with the quiet dignity of a woman who knows her pie is good and knows that sometimes big talk is just another way of saying thank you. The 4 of them ate together at the little table, the fire warming their backs and the winter beating against the outside walls with its usual disregard. The talk turned to practical matters, the welfare check-in. The papers Margaret would help them fill out, and if Billy was strong enough to help John with the horses come morning, a fact Billy confirmed with loud insistence that he was. Mary was quiet through most of the meal, but she cleaned her plate. And when John topped off her cup without asking, she did not even jump. She just took it and drank. After Margaret went home and Billy was fast asleep, John lit the lamp and sat down at the table. He had a way, on nights he could not rest, of just sitting with the lamp in the silence, not reading, not working, just being with the light and the quiet. He had done this most nights for 7 years, and the quiet had always been his alone. Mary appeared from the dark corner where she slept and sat down across from him. She had the big wool blanket pulled around her shoulders and her hair was down, and in the soft lamplight she truly looked like a little girl, which sometimes she did not. "Can't sleep?" he asked her. "My mind's just running." "Mine's just," she said. "About what?" She put her arms on the table and stared at the flickering lamp. "About my mother, and how she'd say, 'Take care of your brother,' every night. I've been doing it for so long, I do not know what I'm supposed to do when I'm not doing it." She frowned a little, not out of sadness, but from the hard work of puzzling something out. "Billy is all right now. He's safe, and I don't have to be the one in charge of it all anymore. And I'm not sure what to do about that." She paused. "Is that strange?" "No," John said. "That is just how it feels when you have carried a heavy load for a long while and someone finally helps you set it down. Your arms still feel the strain of it." She thought about that. "Does it go away? That heavy feeling?" "Yeah. It takes a while, but it fades." "How long?" He looked straight at her. "Mary, you are 9 years old. You have got more time than you know what to do with." A flicker of something crossed her face, the closest he had ever seen her come to a smile. Not a real smile. She was not there yet, not all the way, but it was the promise of one, the shadow a smile makes, right before it shows up. "You are not who I thought you were," she said. "And who did you think I was? I figured all grown men were basically the same. She said it like a simple fact, with no trace of bitterness, just an old idea she was starting to rethink. I am beginning to believe that is not true. It is not, he said. You will find that most things you figure are all one way usually have an exception. Are you the exception? He turned his gaze to the lamp. I am just a man who found 2 children in his barn and did what seemed right. He paused. We will figure out the rest together. She unfolded her arms and sat up, pulling the blanket tight. She glanced at Billy's door. Then she looked at John again. Those green eyes that had measured him since the first night finally settling somewhere new after 12 days. Good night, John, she said. Good night, Mary. She went to her bed and pulled the blanket around her. Soon her breathing slowed and she was sound asleep. Not the watchful sleep of the first nights, but a real, unguarded rest. The sleep of someone who had finally set down a heavy load for good. John sat at the table a while longer. The fire was embers, the cabin quiet. The winter outside was still, as if it too was tired and needed rest. He lit a second candle from the first. He set it beside the lamp and watched them burn together. 2 small, steady flames in the dark, pushing light into a room that held only one for 7 years. He had long told himself being alone was a choice, then a habit, then just the way his life had become when the ground got hard and the world got cold. And caring became too costly a thing for a man like him. He had been wrong about all of it. The truth was simpler and harder. The truth was that winter does not decide who makes it. It just makes things hard. It raises the cost. It strips you down to what is essential and makes you prove it. But it does not get to decide. Outside, the snow lay deep and still, covering fences and fields, the road to town and the road away. And somewhere under all that white, patient and sure, the ground held everything it needed for spring. John blew out the lamp and left the 2 candles burning, one for what the winter took, one for what it did not. And tonight, for the first time in 7 years, the second flame burned stronger. On this channel, we share stories of Western cowboys, love, family, and the deep humanity that connects us all. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
And so, when the wind finally settled and the snow lay quiet across that stretch of Wyoming land, what remained was not just a victory in a courtroom, nor simply a roof over 2 children's heads. What remained was something far rarer in a world like that. It was the quiet, steady beginning of belonging. Because the truth is, this story was never just about Caleb or Lucy or Tommy. It was about something deeper. The moment when a life that has been hardened by loss chooses, against all reason, to soften again. A man who had buried his past in frozen ground, finding himself standing in the doorway of something new. And 2 children who had learned too early that the world could be cruel, discovering, slowly, carefully, that not every hand reaches out to take. Sometimes it reaches out to hold. Lucy, with all her strength, all her sharp edges and careful watching. She reminds us of what it means to carry too much for too long. She teaches us that strength is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going, even when fear is all you've known. And more than that, she shows us that trust is not given freely. It is earned, moment by moment, through patience, consistency, and truth. Tommy, in his quiet, simple way, carries another kind of wisdom, the kind that doesn't come from thinking too hard, but from feeling clearly. He reminds us that sometimes the most honest understanding of the world comes from those who have not yet learned to complicate it. Warmth feels like home. Kindness feels like safety. And when something is good, you hold on to it. And Caleb, perhaps more than anyone, shows us what it means to begin again. Not because the past has stopped hurting, but because something in the present matters more. He reminds us that grief can close a man off from the world, but it does not have to define the rest of his life. That even after years of silence, of distance, of convincing yourself you're better off alone, it only takes one moment of truth to realize that you were never meant to stay that way. Because no matter how harsh the winter, no matter how deep the snow, life has a way of waiting beneath it, waiting for the right moment, the right people, the right kind of courage to break through. And that is the true meaning of this story. It teaches us that love is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like a man standing in a doorway, refusing to step aside. Sometimes it looks like a girl lowering the rock in her hand, just enough to listen. Sometimes it looks like a small boy reaching for a hand and deciding, without hesitation, that it is safe. It reminds us that the world can be cruel, but it is not only cruel. That systems can fail, people can betray, and trust can be broken. But none of that erases the possibility of something better. And most importantly, it tells us that no one is meant to face the storm alone. Because when people stand together, when they choose connection over isolation, courage over fear, compassion over indifference, that is when things begin to change. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to matter, enough to save something that might otherwise have been lost. So if there is one thing to carry with you from this story, let it be this. Even in the coldest seasons of your life, even when it feels like everything has been taken, there is still something worth protecting. There is still something worth opening your heart for. And sometimes, the very thing you think you've lost forever is simply waiting for you to recognize it again. And maybe, just maybe, home isn't a place you find. It's something you build with the people you choose to stand beside.